Welcome to the second in our Wesley Impact series, where we're looking at John Wesley and his influence upon the world. I'm here in Oxford at Lincoln College, where for many years John Wesley was a fellow. When John went up to Oxford, he discovered a number of people that were serious about the religious life, and in practical and intellectual ways they sought to find Christ and live out the Christian way. That was to have a profound influence on him and the Methodist movement across the world, not least in Australia, as we celebrate 200 years since that work began. And at Wesley Mission, we've always valued the importance of the mind and thinking faith. So welcome to this programme. I hope you really enjoy it.
In 1713, John was admitted to Charterhouse School in London, where he lived a very studious, methodical life, which he'd been trained in at home. In 1720, he entered Christ Church, Oxford, and was ordained deacon in 1725, and elected Fellow of Lincoln College in the following year. He served his father as a curate 2 years, and then returned to Oxford to fulfil his functions as a Fellow. The year of his return to Oxford, which was 1729, marks the beginning of the rise of Methodism, and the Holy Club was formed.
And it was in rooms such as this that the Holy Club began to meet. These were men who were intent on the spiritual life, in prayer and fasting, in reading the Bible, and in putting their faith into practice. And that for them meant visiting the prisons and caring for the poor.
While the Holy Club never actually exceeded more than 25 members, it was the practice to give away all that they had after providing for their own necessities. John Wesley himself, having £30 a year, lived on 28 and gave away 2. By the 4th year he received £120 and still lived on 28 as before, giving all the rest away to the needy. The Holy Club members fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays, received Holy Communion every week, studied and discussed the Greek New Testament and the classics. I met up with a friend, Reverend Dr. Ralph Waller, the principal of Harris Manchester College and a Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University, to tell us more.
What would it be like for somebody like John to come up to Oxford?
Well, colleges were very small in those days. Christ Church wouldn't have had many students. In fact, they'd have probably had 99 students altogether, or perhaps 101 would have been the most that they'd have had. So he would have felt at home in one sense there, although there's no doubt a culture shock. But his father had come to Exeter College, his grandfather, Dr. Annesley, had been at Queen's College, his mother had given him a good education at home, and at Charterhouse I think he'd been well prepared for Oxford. So I think he fitted in quite well, really.
Many things that he learnt in the Holy Club were to influence the Methodist movement, weren't they?
They were, and I think particularly this twofold emphasis upon social concern, where they visited prisons, they looked after poor people, and spirituality were carried with him for the rest of his life. And I think the model for the Holy Club really became the model for Methodism.
I wonder if we could just explore the importance of education in the wider ministry of John Wesley, and then in the movement that followed, but firstly in John Wesley's total ministry.
Well, I think what Oxford did was it taught him to read and write and think for himself. It taught him to present an argument and to defend an argument and be sympathetic with somebody with a different point of view. And I think that carried with him. He felt education was part of his evangelism, really, enabling people to develop the talents that God had given them was a very much part of his movement, really. So education was at the heart of it. And he carried that into his schools, and it gradually, his followers founded universities and schools and academies, and so education has always been a huge part of Methodism.
And look, you have people coming from America, from Carolina, from states where education has been so important in the Methodist sense, to Oxford today.
Yes, we get a lot of people, coming, and in fact we've got a group coming from Atlanta, from Emory University, which is a Methodist university, this summer. So we get a lot of people coming from all over the world to Oxford, and many of those are coming from institutions that John Wesley helped found.
I wonder if I could just take hold of, many people are sort of suspicious, and especially those of a more conservative understanding of theology might say you've really got to hold to the truth and you can't enter into a controversy with somebody else. Now that's something that John wouldn't have understood, would he? Because he knew what it was to debate and argue, clearly as you've said from his Oxford background, but it's a matter of faith principle too.
Yes, I think that's true. He did feel that it was important to discuss the faith, to argue it, to make sure that people sort of intellectually thought about their faith. One of his great contributions, I think, to theology was the formation factors of theology. What many people thought, and even great theologians, have seen the formation factors: the Bible, the church, the reason. Religious experiences, perhaps four horses yoked together, pulling the cart of religion. But Wesley saw it differently. He saw it as as sort of like a child's mobile,
yeah,
with the Bible in the middle, and round the edge was reason, and then you had the church, the Christian community, and then you had religious experience. So the Bible, so if you had religious experience, it was always interpreted in the light of the Bible, or the Christian community, the church, was always interpreted in the light of the Bible. And then the wind blows the mobile round, so you get the Bible interpreted in the light of reason, or the Bible interpreted in the light of Christian experience, or the Bible interpreted in the light of the church.
And Colin Williams has written about this,
yes,
hasn't he?
And I think that was true. I think that's a very, very important contribution that Wesley made.
What do you think that John Wesley has to say in the realm of thought today? I know it's hard to move forward 3 centuries and start talking about, but I think perhaps there are some things that were true about him that we still learn from.
And I think one of the keys to me on this was, it's difficult to disseminate from all his sermons what was his essential message, but he does put this across on one occasion. He was trying to help a man who tried to commit suicide, a man who'd lost all his money and he wanted to take his own life, and Wesley was helping him. And this man said to Wesley, "What's at the heart of your preaching?" And Wesley said, "Well, really to make people good and useful citizens and at ease with themselves." That was interesting that he started on that. But then secondly said, to lead those who would listen to God and to Jesus and to heaven. And then thirdly, he makes the point that he preached the gospel of kindness and love that he found within the Bible. And fourthly, he said he wanted to enable people to enjoy God and to overcome the fear of death. And I think that's still a very, very important message in the age in which we live.
And in a kind of cauldron, in places like Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard and Sydney University, in universities of the world, the Christian has to engage in a very real way with challenging issues still today. And does this Wesley thing help us in all of that?
Well, I think it does. I mean, if you look at Wesley's life, he actually did write to the Prime Minister of his day. He was engaged in sort of the anti-slavery campaign at a very early stage. We see him going down to Bristol and preaching against slavery, the slave trade, and so he was keen on prison reform. He was keen on helping poor people, found workers' cooperatives. The knitters were a good example. He found ladies who were knitting who really couldn't make a living. But he realised that if he organised them into a cooperative, they could manage themselves without... he was keen on poor people having good medical treatment. So a lot of his things are so relevant to the age in which we live.
Look, we live in an age where we have lists of people, the great and the good, the people who are best. Yes. If you had a list, Ralph, where would John Wesley figure in terms of influence that an Oxford man or woman has ever made?
Well, I mean, we've had some great people in Oxford, but I would put Wesley right at the top because I think he was the Oxford man who made the biggest difference to the world. But by founding a church which today has some 60 million members, by the universities throughout the world who were Methodist foundations, by hospitals and schools. And so I would think he is the person, the Oxford man, who made the biggest difference to the world.
Ralph Waller, thank you for that assessment, and most of all, thank you for giving us the privilege of sharing with you in your home and your college.
Well, it's been very good to speak to you again, Keith. Thank you.
On our travels, I also was pleased to visit Oxford Memorial Methodist Church. Martin Wellings is the superintendent of the Oxford Circuit and was himself a student at Oxford University. I was interested to know if John Wesley's influence resonates with students today.
Reverend Dr. Martin Wellings, it's good to talk to you. Oxford was so influential on the life of John Wesley, and I'm thinking particularly of the Holy Club for a moment. What was it about the Holy Club that John discovered that would be influential later in his life?
I think the Holy Club helped to give shape to John Wesley's personal spirituality, giving his instinct for disciplined Christianity a corporate dimension. It was also an opportunity for him to give leadership to a group of young men who were enthusiastic about their faith. And through the Holy Club, Wesley discovered in a new way mission to and mission alongside people in great need in the city.
And so even in those very early days, there was a practicality that grew out of the spirituality.
Absolutely. Faith was very much put into practice alongside people in Oxford who were in prison, people who were poor families, children needing to learn to read and so on.
And what about John Wesley, in your estimation, in terms of Christian history, his place in history, and his place in the present world church?
I think Wesley is a pivotal figure in the history of world Christianity, not only through the Methodist movement, which stemmed from his work and his brother's work and those others who were with them, but leading to a world communion of some 70 million members and adherents in every continent of our world. Also enormously influential on a whole range of other traditions through the evangelical revival in the 18th century, touching lots of other denominations, giving rise to such later movements as the Salvation Army and the Pentecostal and holiness movements, and offering a resource, particularly through the wonderful Wesley hymns, of course, to many traditions, including the Anglican and the Roman Catholic.
And today, in the World Methodist family, there are many, many different kinds of churches, aren't there? And the strength of the church has, if you like, moved south, hasn't it?
I think one of the huge changes in the 20th century has been the growth of the global south, and so the centre of gravity of world Christianity and of world Methodism has shifted from the Anglo-American world to the south, yes.
And Africa and Asia is now something of that.
And Latin America as well, of course.
Tell me, here in Oxford, the John Wesley Society, the Student Society here, goes back 125 years. And I think you're privileged to be a minister here, but you actually were a student here in Oxford. How real do you think is the need of offering what the Wesley message is to students at university today?
I think it's really important because Wesley brings together a disciplined mind and a committed spirituality, and then applies both of those to living the Christian life in the world with all its challenges, temptations and opportunities. So we do try, through the work and worship of this church and through our student work, to offer that sort of combination to young people.
And you yourself, as a minister, how inspired are you personally by that history and tradition? I suppose it's the question, why be a Methodist minister as opposed to any other kind of minister?
Well, I would say that I am a Methodist by upbringing, but also by conversion and by conviction. And all of those things really matter to me. I find John Wesley's example both inspiring and challenging. And I find that my own personal spiritual life is fed by the works of the Wesleys, particularly by the hymns, but by Wesley's writings as well.
And a city like Oxford, which is known for the controversy that sometimes exists in a city like this, you have on one hand people who would want to rigorously deny the very basis of the Christian faith, and you have on the other hand people who are involved in apologetics, in the cut and thrust. How real is that debate here when you're living in the middle of it?
It's very real. If I could tell you a story, a couple of weeks ago, we brought into membership and baptised here a young man who was a postgraduate student who came up to Oxford as an atheist, although having Christian friends, read some of the works of the so-called new atheists and found that their story did not square with his experience of Christian people. And really, through the work of the John Wesley Society and through the worship of this church, he has become a committed Christian and is now living out his faith in his studies and also as a member of Oxford City Council, so he's very active in the political sphere. And he gave a very moving testimony in our worship on the day that he was baptised and confirmed and came into membership.
That's a wonderful story, really, an important one. What do you see as the challenges looking forward for churches in university towns and thinking environments in making a living witness?
I think part of the challenge is to present a message which is intellectually credible and also spiritually alive, and which encourages young people then to put faith into practice in their locality and in the wider world, and to prevent practice and brain and emotion flying apart. So that's the challenge, and to do that in an environment which sometimes is either unfriendly or incredibly busy doing other things.
I mean, John Wesley later in his life said, "Oh, to be an Oxford Methodist again, and to enjoy." And I don't think that is just about locale. What do you think he meant by that?
I suspect that he looked back with a certain amount of rose-tinted hindsight to the intimacy of the fellowship that he'd enjoyed in the Holy Club, to perhaps being free of responsibility for, at that stage, a nationwide movement with all the issues that arose for him. Perhaps a place where he could concentrate on his own walk with God and not feel that he had to be looking out for other people.
It's been 200 years since the first Methodists met in Australia. To celebrate 2 centuries of faith and pioneering care, CEO and presenter Reverend Dr. Keith Garner takes us back to where it all began.
But we don't begin here at the heart of London. We begin in a town in the north of England.
In this fascinating narrative, Reverend Garner chronicles the history of the life and times of the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. This fresh and thought-provoking documentary takes us on a journey throughout the United Kingdom, beginning in John Wesley's hometown of Epworth.
John Wesley was born here on the 17th of June, 1703.
This 1-hour DVD travels onto his education years and beginnings of social justice in Oxford, to his final years in London. For more information on John Wesley, the man and his mission, call 02 9263 5555 or email us at impacttv@wesleymission.org.au.
We're continuing our series looking at sermons of John Wesley and looking at now one of the most famous sermons he ever preached, called The Almost Christian. Now, this was preached in Oxford University, where I'm speaking from today, here in Lincoln College, where John was a fellow of the university. But the sermon was preached in the University Church of St Mary's in Oxford on the 25th of July, 1741. Now, this is 3 years after John has entered into his heartwarming experience. He's been transformed. He has a new take on religion in every sense of the word. Gathered in the congregation are university leaders, characters of the city, people of significance. And he took as his text Acts 26 and verse 28, and I read, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." Now that text is clearly from the authorised version, and it's rendered in a particular way. But John Wesley builds on that thought and helps us to understand something of its meaning. If we were to interpret that verse today and translate it, we might say, "In such a short time, you're persuading me to be a Christian." But Paul is before King Agrippa and making a defence for the Christian faith. Wesley makes a distinction in this sermon between being the almost Christian and the altogether Christian. He says there are many who go so far as being almost, in the sense of expressing in their life, they follow all the rules, all the things that are there that are important in terms of worship and life and service, but they're not altogether Christian. So he asks, what is implied by being almost? In being almost, Wesley says that the Christian is almost practicing an unbelieving honesty. By the rules in which people taught and by the way the Christian faith was understood, they do nothing that is wrong. They really know what it is to be seen to be doing what is right. This implies a form of godliness, but denies the deeper power within, to quote the New Testament. And there is something very real about this kind of living that he says is dangerous. This kind of person is in a situation where he or she does nothing that the gospel forbids. He or she labours and suffers for the good of many. And he or she uses the means of grace at every and each opportunity. And he or she may well share in family prayers and know what it is to have a deep devotional life. The almost Christian can be sincere and have an inward principle of religion. But it is a very, very different thing than altogether. To quote Wesley directly, "But could a man go so far as this and be almost a Christian?" Then he very cleverly used himself as the example, as he said, "I did go thus far for many years, and I was but almost a Christian." You can imagine the stirring in the congregation as he said those words. He then said, what is meant by being altogether a Christian? Firstly, an altogether a Christian is somebody who has a love for God, takes up all the affections, fill the entire capacity of their life, employs themselves and all their faculties to the very, very limit in the service of God. And secondly, they have a love for neighbour. There's one thing that's implied by being altogether a Christian, said Wesley, and that was to do with faith, exercising faith, knowing what it is to truly love God. And then thirdly and finally, he asked the question of his congregation. Perhaps it's the kind of question that the congregation didn't appreciate. He said, "Am I of that number?" And by it, of course, he was saying, "Are you of that number?" He reckoned that in his congregation he had many people who were conscientious, who held great standing, who knew what it was week by week to worship in the cathedrals and churches of not only this city but many cities. And they were alive in their understanding of religion, but not necessarily alive in their faith. Finally, in Wesley's own words, we read this: "May we all thus experience what it is not to be almost only, but altogether Christians, being justified freely by his grace, through the redemption that is in Jesus, knowing we have peace with God through Jesus Christ, rejoicing in the hope of the glory of God, and having the love of God shed abroad in our hearts through the Holy Spirit given to us." Well, Wesley upset many people, very often by sharing that direct truth about what it was to believe. He gave the congregation an option. He said, you can be an almost Christian or you can be an altogether Christian. It's a good question for me to ask, and perhaps a good one for you to ask.
To commemorate 200 years of faith and pioneering care in Australia, Wesley Mission has released a publication documenting its work in the community.
Everyone needs a little rest, everyone needs a little joy.
For more information on today's people, today's story, you can contact us on 02 9263 5555 or email us at impacttv@wesleymission.org.au.
I hope you've really enjoyed being with us here on Wesley Impact from Oxford. Well, next week we're heading off to Bristol in the west of England. John's centres were in Bristol, London and Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. When we head off to Bristol, we'll be joining with Methodists there who are celebrating the conversion of John Wesley. So until the same time next week, goodbye and God bless you from Wesley Impact.
To sing my